Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself. "O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. In the last couple of weeks, I've been meditating on the words of today's Gospel. The one who humbles himself will be exalted. And I started to think back about the examples of humility that I've seen in my lifetime, the people who have been called to work very hard without a lot of recognition. And so I think back, and I can think of different groups. The mothers that I grew up with, my own mom and the other mothers of the neighborhood, and they didn't get much recognition for all the work they did. And the nuns and the teachers at my grade school. And then, looking forward a little bit more in my life, I think about over the past 45 years, I've worked with a group who really do work hard with humility. They don't get a lot of recognition, and those are members of the nursing profession. And so I started thinking about the members of the nursing profession and the history of nursing, and you can't read about that for very long without coming upon the name of the foundress of modern nursing. And I started reading about her. She is also a great example, an image of humility. And this, of course, is Florence Nightingale. Her story began in 1820. She was born into a very wealthy British family, and they had a big mansion, and they had all the material niceties of the world. And Florence herself got a very good education. She learned several languages, all the arts and sciences, and you'd think that she would get all that education in order to make her ready for a career serving others. But this was Victorian England, and the reason that young ladies were educated back then was so that they could be seen as refined, so that they could have a certain status in society and perhaps be attracted to well-to-do young men with the goal that they would eventually get married to a well-to-do young man. Well, Florence herself wanted nothing to do with this. She said, "What's the good of having all these things that I've received if I can't use them to help others?" And she kept a diary of her life when she was growing up and beyond. And she writes in the diary, when she was 17 years old, she had a mystical encounter with the Lord. She wrote, "God called me one morning and asked me would I do good for Him and Him alone without reputation." So God was asking her to cast aside the well-to-do things of this life and serve Him alone without regard to how she was perceived by others. And she had a very wonderful reply. She said, "I consider it a blessing to have been called, however unworthy, to be the handmaid of the Lord." She was thinking, of course, of the example of the Annunciation, the Virgin Mary submitting herself in humility before God's plan. And so pretty soon she decided her calling was to become a nurse. So she went and announced this to her parents, and I guess back then you needed your parents' permission to do such a thing. And her parents were aghast because in 19th century England, at least in the early part of the 19th century, nurses were thought of as the lowest profession there was. They were completely uneducated, often alcoholics, and they couldn't get work doing anything else, so they were nurses. And her parents thought that it was beneath her and beneath her family, and so for years and years they delayed giving her permission, and she got to be 30 years old before they finally gave her permission to become a nurse. And again, she writes in her diary, "I am 30, the age at which Christ began his mission. Now, no more childish things. No more vain things, no more love, no more marriage. Now, Lord, let me only think of thy will." And the resolution sounds a lot like a vow in a religious order. She was vowing to cast aside the worldly things of this life and even promising chastity in order to serve God. And so, with her parents' permission at last, she went forth and learned the trade of nursing. She had to go to Germany to get to a good nursing school, and she knew German, so that wasn't a big problem. And she studied there, and she returned to London, and she worked at a hospital in London for a year. And she was so proficient and so innovative, pretty soon she was the nursing supervisor at the hospital. But then something happened that led to her destiny. Great Britain in 1854 entered the Crimean War, which was a struggle against Russia in the Crimean Peninsula, and pretty soon young British men were being sent off to do battle, and of course the casualties mounted, and there were a number of wounded soldiers, and what the British did was they put the wounded soldiers on a ship and they sailed across the Black Sea to Constantinople to hospitals there, and the hospitals were run by British doctors. But word got back to Britain that things weren't going very well. The young men were not being well cared for. There was a lot of infection, and even more men were dying of infection than were dying of war injuries. And there was such a concern that the British Secretary of War knew Florence Nightingale, and he asked her to take a group of nurses to go over to the hospitals in Constantinople to see if they could make things better. Well, Florence got 38 nurses together, and she went forth to Constantinople. And when they entered the biggest hospital, they saw why things were not going well. The place was a filthy mess. The soldiers were not being well cared for. The dressings were dirty. The sheets in the beds were dirty. There was spoiled food lying all over the place, and blood and filth everywhere, and there were rats running around. So the first thing they did was getting scrub brushes and mops and just scouring the place and making it clean. And then they organized the supplies, and then they did what nurses did. They went around to patients and they changed their bed sheets and they changed their dressings, and they made sure that they had fresh fruit to eat and fresh food. And then they went around to the bedside and listened to the patients' concerns and talked to them. And of all the nurses, it was said that Florence got up earlier than everybody else to make her nursing rounds and went to bed later than everyone else. And there's these very poignant images of her carrying a lamp around at night to the different bedsides of the injured soldiers, tending to their needs. And from this she got the nickname Lady with the Lamp. Well, pretty soon the fate of the injured British soldiers got a lot better. They started improving and returning to Britain. They weren't dying of infection anymore, and they brought back the stories of these wonderful nurses, and the most wonderful nurse, Florence Nightingale. She was called the Angel of Crimea. And so when the war finally ended, she returned to Britain to pretty much a heroine's welcome. People were naming their babies Florence. And she got a lot of attention, which she really didn't want. But one thing she did use was that she got a large cash award from the Queen of England. And she used that to build a hospital in London, St. Thomas Hospital. And she designed the hospital, and in the hospital, she put together the first modern nursing school. And so young women would come into the nursing school and they would be educated, they would be trained, and then they went forth as skilled nurses, and the nursing profession got a certain dignity, and suddenly nurses were well thought of, and even wealthy families would let their children go into nursing. Now, through her life, Florence battled a lot of illness, but she managed to carry on. And in addition to running the nursing school, she was a very prolific writer, and she wrote a lot about hospital planning, and she was an advocate for the poor and those in workhouses that they should receive proper nursing care. And she was a world-famous advisor. The Americans came to her during the Civil War and asked how they could take care of their injured soldiers. But most of all, she was a bedside nurse, and there's these very moving stories of her at the bedside of these women who had led perhaps disreputable lives and lived in poverty their whole lives, and they were afraid of what would lie beyond this life for them. And Florence would reassure them that the God who had called her, Florence Nightingale, into service was a very merciful God. And so today we can look around and we see the Nightingale Pledge that nursing students make upon graduation, and the Nightingale Awards that are given to very successful and giving nurses. But more than anything else, we see the exaltation of Florence Nightingale through all the nurses throughout the world who serve others in her image. And so we come back to the words of today's gospel. The one who humbles himself will be exalted. And we hear Christ paint this vivid contrast between the tax collector, who looks only upon himself as a humble, sinful servant of the Lord, and he's contrasted to this Pharisee who is wallowing and basking in his own self-esteem, only seeing himself favorably in comparison to others. And to be honest about it, when I look upon myself, frankly, I see more of the Pharisee in my own inclinations than I would like to. C.S. Lewis said, "Pride is the greatest sin to which nobody's immune." So I guess temptation to pride is the worst temptation. And so if I ask myself, how do I avoid that temptation to bask in the esteem of others and my own self-regard, I can think back on the images, the examples of humility that I've seen in my life. My own mother, my teachers, the nuns at my school, and then I can think about all the nurses that I've encountered through the years. And like them, I can tell myself, I can serve the Lord, His humble handmaid, without regard to reputation. And if I strive to do that and that alone throughout this life, I will receive exaltation in the life to come. Amen.